This is a ROM hack of Fire Emblem 8, and man, is it cool. I can honestly say that in all my years of playing ROM hacks, I never expected to see something quite like this. The amount of work that it takes to terraform one game and turn it into something completely different that is unrecognizable in almost every area cannot be understated. But that description alone pales in comparison to what Pokémblem has actually done, which is so insane that it blasts my balls off every time I look at it. Not to be confused with my rival Balls, who also gets blasted off every time I see him. Anyway, let's talk about Pokémblem. Immediately, the game will ask you if you want to use the built-in randomizer, which you actually can use because it scales your encounters, though it will have higher peaks and lower plateaus than normal gameplay. Then you choose your name and gender and all that, and boom, you're in Oak's lab. Despite fast-tracking you through the plot, it has a lot of time to be funny, and this is mostly because the game doesn't explain itself very well, but that's alright. After all, if you're playing this, you probably already know what the heck a Pokemon is and why you're leaving town at the age of 10. But instead of just getting the same easy rival battle, you're actually pitted up against both other Pokemon that you didn't pick. Oak will spawn in a Pikachu and help you after the first turn, but you can actually get soft locked here in the randomizer depending on what you're up against, which is kind of fun. A bit of a weird thing to say, but honestly, some Pokemon just aren't deserving to be alive. If you pick Magikarp as your starter, you don't deserve to be a trainer. You deserve to be dead. In Pokémblem, of course. After you get out of Oak's lab, you can see one of the first major highlights of this game. You can just walk around. That's not something you can do in Fire Emblem. Normally everything is grid-based, just like how the combat is, so you might expect there to be battle areas and then non-battle areas where you can walk around, but that's not really true. You're always allowed to be in free walk mode, actually, unless you're in range of something that can hit you, which is defined by these red areas. I do find that they're a little ugly, but they get the point across. As you'll soon see upon entering Route 1, the game will introduce you to a catching tutorial where, once again, the game is grid-based. And if you actually read the text in this tutorial, then it'll tell you things like how damage is calculated, but we're just gonna assume you already know how Fire Emblem works. There's also one little deviation to both Fire Emblem and Pokemon, which is mentioned here and then mentioned again in a notice later. And this deviation is that you cannot miss attacks. Instead, you deal glancing blows, which deal half damage. As I stated, this isn't a feature in either game, and I'm not entirely sure why it was put in. In my few playthroughs, I remember missing almost nothing, but maybe it's that the NPCs would miss so often that they weren't dealing any damage and therefore weren't posing a challenge. It's at this point that you can reselect your trainer and just start walking around again. If you touch a red zone, then you'll be forced to stop, and in this case, I decide to trigger a trainer interaction so that you can see what happens. And once again, it's just a little bit mind-blowing. He starts talking to you and then he throws out his Rattata and the battle begins. It should be noted that this isn't quite like the Pokemon battles where everything is separated and you go one Pokemon at a time. No, everybody can join in on the party, including wild Pokemon, though they'll only be attacking you. You also might have noticed the berry tree down there because this game has berries. You can use them to heal for 10 HP, but they'll also automatically be used if they're equipped by your Pokemon at the start of each turn. Functionally, this means all the berries are Oran berries, but I suppose this is a reference to Gen 2 when they were just called berries. Moving forward, I capture this Rattata just for good measure, and once again, it just costs 300 gold because there are no actual Pokeball items in this game. I suppose that takes a little bit of the fun out of capturing Pokemon, but hey, I'm just impressed that it works this well. As you might notice in some of the gameplay, I'm often using the AoE function, and that's because most of the moves can be used as AoE attacks, where they deal less damage and have their effects slightly muted if they do anything like reduce stats, but they also can't be retaliated against. And this makes them a good method to get safe EXP for your weaker Pokemon, or just to increase the speed of your murder. There are also equipable held items like the Muscle Band, which increases strength as I have shown here, and type effectiveness is programmed into the game, with one fault, and that's that resistances will always overwrite whatever other interaction is going on. For example, you can see that Pidgey resists a fighting type move even though normally it's neutral because the fighting type move is super effective to Pidgey's normal type, but resisted by Pidgey's flying type, canceling the two out. In this game, the resistance just takes priority, which makes certain type combinations a lot better than they normally are. One thing that I also really did not expect to see in this game is that stab bonuses do exist. The same type attack bonus, meaning that a fire type will deal more damage using a fire type move than they would using a non-fire type move, even with the same specs. And in case it seems like it's going to be a drag to get from one place to another, don't worry, there is fast travel in every location, even the ones where it doesn't really matter. Another interesting aspect of the game is that flying Pokemon can actually fly, and water-type Pokemon can actually travel across water. This allows you to get some items that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get in normal Pokemon. Now, if only I could just walk around these rocks. I mean, they can't be that big, right? The Pokemon Center here functions as a save point, a way to heal your Pokemon, and a way to change the members of your team. I did erroneously say in the short that I made about this that your Pokemon will die in real life if they get killed in the game, but that clearly wasn't true. After all, Pokemon aren't real. They can't die in real life. But there's no Fire Emblem-esque permadeath either. You can just get your Pokemon back from any Pokemon Center. I was confused by this at first though, because I had only lost my first Pokemon after being around the save point in Viridian Forest. And while save points do heal your team, they don't allow you to revive or change out your team. Anyway, you're probably thinking when you look at these big rocks that you just can't do the second rival battle since it's optional in the regular games anyway, but nope, it's been incorporated into the story and just moved on to Route 2. In a somewhat cool and fitting fashion, the rival will actually ambush you. In Fire Emblem, an ambush spawn means a spawn that will move before you get an opportunity to actually see them and react to them. Generally, they're regarded as pretty unfair, but in this case, they're done as well as you can ask for. It's not like you won't know where the rival is. I mean, you see him, he talks to you. He breaks the fourth wall with colored text that says, "I am ambushing you. Get ready to be bushed by my am." I go into the fight with only 5 Pokemon, and it kind of highlights my one problem with the game, and that's that it's a bit too easy. I'm on the hardest difficulty, my Pokemon are pretty much as weak as they could possibly be, but Balls was kind of a pushover, only taking out my one Pokemon because, yeah, it has a super effective move against it. And I probably could have avoided that death if I was seriously considering my options, but I wasn't. And I imagine that most of the people that have trouble with this game are having trouble because they don't know what their options are, or they're not seriously considering them before making a move. If you're not already intimately familiar with the mechanics of both Pokemon and Fire Emblem, I could see this game kinda kicking your balls. In fact, the first time I played, it was kinda kicking my balls because I wasn't stopping to read all the directions that the game was giving me. And maybe it's a good thing. I mean, if you know what you're doing, and you just want to go through the story, you probably should be able to beat it, even at a higher difficulty. In fact, the game might have been built around the idea that people are gonna Nuzlocke it. And if that's the case, then I can't really say that it's too easy. I mean, any death being permanent would set you back a lot, and then suddenly your deaths would start spiraling out of control, and plus this game has a built-in randomizer, so I guess I could give it a pass. Based on what I've seen from the Discord and some other areas, I think I'm in the minority in that opinion anyway. Most people seem to believe that the game is pretty darn hard, just like my ball. In Viridian Forest, we get to bear witness to the next really cool mechanic, and that's boss Pokemon. These Pokemon have an ability which state that they're temporarily invincible, which at first made me think that I just wasn't supposed to go near them until I had collected more badges or something. But no, the actual mechanic is that it works kind of like a trainer, where once you come near it, it's going to spawn a bunch of smaller Pokemon that you'll be able to take out that will then make it vulnerable. You can actually catch these boss monsters though, so there's not a lot of point to doing this one. I think it's just meant to be a tutorial, and for that it works well. If you still don't know what you're doing by this time, and you don't have good Pokemon to go up against the Beedrill, then you would get whooped. But as you can see here, I'm able to dispatch the boss and I only take one hit. However, unlike before, I'm not the weakest that I could possibly be if I was here. If I was the weakest, then I probably would have lost a Pokemon, but I did catch some new Pokemon and I had to double back to put them into my party. As you should expect from a Pokemon game, you can only have 6 Pokemon with you at any time. Enemy trainers and bosses will respect this rule, however, they can actually team up on you to create more than 6 enemies at a time, but generally you're only going to have to deal with 6 yourself. And with careful positioning, you should be able to get the jump on them basically every time, even if they're an ambush spawn. And this is where that lack of difficulty that I was talking about kind of comes in. You're pretty much always engaging with the advantage, so unless your Pokemon are significantly below par or you're just playing dumb, then you should come out on top of every encounter. I'm not saying this to discourage you from trying the game yourself, but I do hope that you remember me saying that when you inevitably lose, and I hope it stings a little bit. Salt in the wound. Another cool feature is that you're sometimes able to rent other people's Pokemon to help you out as green units. They basically act as another AI, but they're fighting with you instead of against you. In randomizer runs, these guys can be surprisingly not helpful, but it is somewhat amusing just to see them instantly get knocked out. You can even deal damage to them using AoE moves.
Hey, look at this, Lois, it's our pet rook.
Well, you can actually do that to your own Pokemon too, but it's a lot more amusing when it doesn't negatively impact you. Oh yeah, and statuses are in this game too. The game won't actually mention it for a lot of moves, but they still have their standard chance of inflicting a status, such as Thundershock inflicting a status on this Weedle. They work about how you'd expect, with Paralysis taking this Weedle's speed down to nothing. It also has a chance to eat up your turn, which I demonstrate by paralyzing myself. Rip Rattata. In the mart, you can buy a number of TMs, as well as a jelly donut, which is an exquisite reference to the English dub of the anime.
These donuts are great! Jelly-filled are my favorite! Nothing beats a jelly-filled donut!
Into the gym, we get some fun dialogue replacing the normal dialogue from Brock. Instead of having trainers that lead up to a boss battle, the gym is always just the boss battle, which in my opinion is an improvement because I don't actually want to sit through the meaningless pre-gym encounters that are usually just there to train up your Pokemon. And Brock is actually a pretty tough fight. You can see he takes out 3 of my Pokemon, but this is mainly because his Onix has a drying pan, which negates its weakness to water type moves.
My trusty frying pan as a drying pan.
As per usual, if you chose Bulbasaur or Squirtle, you should have a pretty easy time getting through this gym, but if you chose Charmander like me, then you'll want to go to the mart and pick up Mudshot beforehand, as well as perhaps Icy Wind for your Psyduck if you chose to get that. All that said, I kind of recommend playing with a randomizer. I do feel like it's a little bit more fun just to use your favorite Pokemon, but the downside of it is that the challenge is further removed because enemies no longer have cohesive teams. Not always, sometimes it can be a lot harder. For example, some of the very early trainers in Viridian Forest that normally have Weedle can actually have higher level decent Pokemon. All the encounters will still be scaled, so it's not like they're going to be Dragonite or Charizard or anything, but well, he may have one-shot me with some Kabuto in past runs. On one hand, I kinda want to go through the rest of the game and just keep explaining it as though I'm doing one of those reviews where 90% of it is padded out by me just giving you the rundown of the game, but there's not really a lot of surprises in this game, and so I want you to find most of them yourself. It's not like this is stuck behind a paywall and 90% of you are never going to touch it and are just using this video as a way to vicariously live through me and experience this game. No, you can play it for free on your phone or anything else for that matter. I'll leave a link to it in the description. There are a few more things that I wanted to talk about though, and the first is Soaring. Man, is this cool. This is taken from a Fire Emblem ROM hack called Flyer Emblem and modified to use the Kanto map and, of course, look like you're riding on a Latios, which is an awesome reference to Alpha Sapphire and Omega Ruby, and it replaces the fly mechanic here, kind of like it does there. I had the opportunity to interview Vesly, the main creator of the ROM hack, and I asked him specifically why he did this because despite being cool, it's obviously a lot of effort and doesn't really benefit the game in any way, given that Fire Emblem 8 already had a map system where you could have easily incorporated fast travel. He responded just by saying, well, it would have been cool and the Wizard's Creed. Do first, ask if it would be a good idea later, which is more than a respectable answer. He also said he had put in more than 1,000 hours in this ROM hack, which I feel like is more than an understatement. There's just so much different about the game. There's a few other things that I wanted to say which I can't feel like I can incorporate anywhere else, so I'll just spill my spaghetti here and you can all listen. All of the vitamins in Pokemon have been replaced with stat boosters that will increase your stats by 1. That's half of what you would normally get in Fire Emblem, but their price has also been half too, or at least close to half. It's half of what it would be in Pokemon, which is coincidentally very similar to what would be half in Fire Emblem. This isn't a problem, it's a good way to incorporate vitamins actually, but the very, very strange thing is that for some reason, the health boosting item, which ordinarily gives you 7 to max HP, was rounded up. And it wasn't just rounded up from 3.5 to 4 HP, it was rounded up to 5 HP, which makes it way, way better than a defense boost or a resistance boost, or actually pretty much any other stat. You'd just want to max your HP first. And the HP caps are generally pretty high, going above 65. The biggest challenge of the game comes when you start to lose Pokemon and have to fight with less than a full team, so raising your max HP is pretty much just the best option by far. It's a really minor thing to have a gripe about, but it's really the only criticism that I can temper all this praise with. That, and I guess the fact that not every Pokemon is in the game yet. Now this makes sense, some of the legendary Pokemon have simply not been made available, but they are bosses. The only other notably absent Gen 1 Pokemon that I thought of was Ditto, which makes a lot of sense considering there's no analog to a Ditto's transform in any of the GBA Fire Emblem games. But interestingly, the original Fire Emblem game actually does have a Ditto analog. There's a character named Zane from the very first Fire Emblem game in 1990 who works pretty much exactly like Ditto, as he can transform into a near exact copy of any of your other units, with one exception being his max HP. It wouldn't surprise me if somebody has already put in the work to create a Zane in the GBA Fire Emblem games, but I've never actually seen it, so it could still be untreaded ground, I suppose. One thing's for sure though, Kaga did it first. I had also asked Vesly what he was most proud of in the game, and he said that it was the area of effect moves, which were apparently coded in by him from scratch. And I gotta say, it's really cool to have them, and they're quite powerful. Even though they're not from Fire Emblem, or even really from Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, I can't imagine Pokémblem without them. I just feel like the AoEs have become that integral to my experience with it. If you'd like to read my full interview with him, I'll leave a link to it in the description. He gives some pretty long and detailed answers to a few other things that I haven't brought up yet. Ultimately, this was probably the most fun and creative ROM hack I've ever played, and I really, really recommend it. Even if you don't know a lot about Fire Emblem, or Pokemon for that matter, you can probably make it through pretty easily on the lowest difficulty, especially if you paid attention to the video. Oh, but before I let you guys go, there is one last thing I have to say. If you can make it to the very end of the game, you'll be faced up against a sturdy Shedinja. But even if you've watched my video on sturdy Shedinja, the conventional means of killing one won't work here. The only way to take this one out is to